Hello, my friends. I want to start with a blunt truth that the West keeps trying to bury under slogans. Wars don't care what you feel, and they don't care what you tweet. Wars care about logistics, production, manpower, adaptation, speed, and the willingness of a state to absorb pain longer than its opponent. Everything else, the moral theater, the curated narratives, the weekly turning points, the self-congratulating press conferences, those are decorations. And in Ukraine, the West has been living inside decorations while Russia has been building a machine that runs on reality. That doesn't mean Russia's perfect. It doesn't mean Russia never made mistakes. It means something far more important. Russia learns under pressure. And when a serious state learns in war, especially one that sees the war as tied to national survival, you don't get to beat it with wishful thinking. You beat it by out-producing it, out-adapting it, out-enduring it, and out-thinking it. The West is not doing any of those things at scale, not even close. If you want to understand where this war is heading, you have to abandon the cartoon version of it. You have to stop pretending it's a movie where the right side inevitably wins because it's the right side. That's not history. That's not strategy. That's bedtime storytelling for adults who don't want to face ugly arithmetic. And the arithmetic is simple. Ukraine is fighting a war of attrition against a bigger state with deeper reserves, bigger industry, greater strategic depth, and an internal security posture that can sustain wartime measures longer than Western politicians can sustain unpopular budgets. Ukraine's courage is real, its losses are real, its resilience is real, but courage does not manufacture shells. Courage does not replace power plants. Courage does not create air defense interceptors. Courage does not produce trained crews, repair depots, spare barrels, and secure communications at scale. Russia, whatever you think of its politics, is fighting the war the way serious states fight wars. It turns the battlefield into a laboratory, then turns the laboratory into production, and then turns production into relentless pressure. That is what the West refuses to say out loud. And because the West refuses to say it, the West keeps making decisions as if saying we stand with Ukraine is a substitute for solving the material problem. Let me explain the core pathology, because we've seen it before in every American war since Vietnam. A bureaucratic empire becomes addicted to its own narrative. It builds a story that protects careers. It builds a story that keeps money flowing. It builds a story that prevents accountability. And then it punishes anyone who threatens the story because the truth is a threat to the entire machine. That is why Western war leadership so often behaves like a public relations firm with a uniform. It is why commanders can tell you an operation made progress when the enemy walked back into the same positions the next day. It is why a failure can be renamed a strategic recalibration. It is why lost ground becomes shaping operations. It is why casualties become the cost of freedom. It is why, after every war, the same people who were wrong get promoted, and the people who were honest get exiled. Now, bring that habit into Ukraine, and what do you get? You get a Western coalition that speaks like it's managing a project. Quarterly milestones, new funding packages, new initiatives, new frameworks, and new commitments. You get politicians who treat reality as something you can negotiate with. You get media systems that treat war as a moral narrative instead of a logistical contest. And you get a public that is kept on an emotional roller coaster. Outrage, hope, triumph. Outrage again because emotional cycles are easier to manage than hard truths. Russia is not on that roller coaster. Russia is operating under a different psychological and strategic framework, survival and sovereignty, enforced by the logic of geography. Russia is not a small state that can be cornered without consequence. It's not an isolated militia. It's a nuclear power with institutional memory, strategic patience, and a deep suspicion earned through history of hostile alliances creeping toward its border while insisting they are harmless. That's the first major point. The West refuses to internalize. Russia interprets NATO behavior through the lens of threat, not through NATO's self-description. And that's not irrational. That's what states do. States do not base survival decisions on what their rivals promise. They base survival decisions on capabilities, positions, and trajectories. So when NATO leaders start talking like war is inevitable, when they speak as if Russia is coming for us, as if confrontation is a matter of time, those words aren't just rhetoric, they are signals. They are escalatory framing. They are a pressure campaign on domestic populations to accept future mobilization. And they are a provocation to Russia to accelerate its own preparations. That leads to the second point. Actions have consequences, even if you pretend they don't. If you move military infrastructure closer, if you intensify intelligence operations, if you increase weapons flows, if you talk openly about readiness to strike, you create conditions where Russia's rational response is to harden its posture, expand its capacity, and treat the entire theater as a prelude to a broader confrontation. And here's where the West's arrogance becomes dangerous. It behaves as if escalation is something Russia does, not something NATO invites. It behaves as if Russia has no agency, only reactions, and that those reactions can be managed like a risk in a policy memo. That is the kind of thinking that starts wars nobody wants. Now let's get concrete, because modern war is concrete. The battlefield of Ukraine has become a war of sensors, drones, electronic warfare, and industrial throughput. In the early phase, people were shocked by how exposed armor could be. Then came cages. Then came countermeasures. Then came better drones. Then came better jamming. Then came new guidance methods. Then came more drones. And then came the real lesson. This is not a one-time technological shift. It is a continuous evolutionary cycle. The winning side is the side that can innovate faster than the other side can counter and then produce that innovation in large quantities. Ukraine has shown creativity. Russia has shown adaptation. But Russia has something Ukraine does not: scale without dependence. Ukraine is dependent on Western supply chains and political will. And political will is not a weapon system. Political will is a mood, fragile, fickle, and subject to elections, scandals, budget fights, inflation, and media fatigue. That dependency is structural. It means every Ukrainian military requirement has to pass through foreign parliaments, foreign bureaucracies, foreign logistics networks, and foreign priorities. It means that even when the West decides to help, the help arrives on timelines that don't match battlefield tempo. And war punishes slow timelines. Russia does not have to negotiate with an election calendar in Berlin or Washington every time it needs to ramp production. Russia does not have to worry that a coalition partner will collapse and delay shells. Russia does not have to debate whether escalation looks bad on television. Russia does not have to market the war to a dozen publics who speak different languages and have different economic pressures. That alone changes the strategic balance over time. Now add the most ignored factor: logistics. Most people have no concept of how brutally logistical modern war is. Guns eat ammunition, vehicles eat fuel, barrels wear out, optics break, tracks snap, engines die, tires shred, radios fail, drones crash. Counter-drone systems require constant tuning and replacement. A frontline unit's effectiveness is not measured by how brave the soldiers are, though bravery matters, but by whether they have the things they need today, not in 6 months, and whether they can be replenished tomorrow, not next year. Russia has built a system designed to keep feeding its forces and grinding down the enemy. It is not glamorous. It is not heroic in a Hollywood sense. It's systematic. It's ugly. It's efficient. And it's exactly how wars of attrition are won. Which brings us to the third point. The West refuses to say Ukraine is being ground down, not in a single dramatic collapse, not in a neat cinematic moment, but through pressure, depletion, and incremental shifts that cumulatively narrow Kyiv's options. The West keeps telling itself that Russia is on the verge of breaking. This is psychological projection. It is the West imagining Russia as a mirror image of itself, politically fragile, economically unable to sustain strain, socially unwilling to accept losses. But Russia's political structure is not Western. Russia's media environment is not Western. Russia's security apparatus is not Western. Russia's tolerance for hardship is shaped by a different history. And Russia's strategic culture is built around endurance. That does not guarantee Russian success, but it does mean Western assumptions about imminent Russian collapse are not analysis, they're hope. And hope is not a plan. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with two realistic trajectories, neither of which Western leaders want to admit publicly. A negotiated end shaped by the battlefield balance, not by Western moral demands. That means Ukraine, backed by the West, eventually accepts terms it doesn't like because the alternative is worse. The longer the war runs under current conditions, the narrower Ukraine's bargaining position becomes. Escalation through miscalculation, a NATO-Russia collision that nobody claims to want, but that becomes possible because of dense military activity, forward deployments, aggressive rhetoric, and the inability of leaders to back down without losing face. The second trajectory is the nightmare, and it is becoming more plausible precisely because Western leadership is addicted to escalation language. They speak as if striking Russia is a matter of bravery, as if deterrence is produced by speeches, as if posturing is a substitute for readiness. Here's the unspoken truth. The West is not ready for a pure war. Not in doctrine, not in industrial base, not in ammunition stockpiles, not in recruitment, not in repair capacity, not in electronic warfare resilience, and not in political unity. Western militaries have spent decades fighting enemies who couldn't shoot back with pure capabilities. That creates habits, bad habits. It creates complacency. It creates a belief that technology will save you even when comms fail. It creates procurement cultures that are slow, corrupt, and insulated from consequences. Russia, meanwhile, has been forced by blood into learning the very lessons Western bureaucracies refuse to learn, because learning would require admission of failure. And that's the central moral inversion of this entire situation. The West talks constantly about morality, but behaves immorally in the most consequential way by refusing to tell its own people the truth about the risks it is creating. A morally serious leadership would say to its public, we cannot defeat Russia the way we defeated Iraq, because Russia is not Iraq. We cannot talk our way into victory. We cannot sustain a war of attrition indefinitely without rebuilding industrial capacity. We cannot promise outcomes we can't enforce. We cannot pretend escalation has no consequences. We must reduce the risk of a NATO-Russia war because that war would be catastrophic. But Western leadership doesn't say that. It says the opposite. It says Russia must accept rules, Russia must be punished, Russia must be contained, Russia must be forced, as if Russia is a misbehaving province rather than a great power. And that brings us to the fourth point. The West confuses dominance with order. When Western leaders say rules-based order, what they often mean, whether they admit it or not, is Western-defined order enforced by Western power. The problem is that enforcement only works if you have credible superiority. If your superiority is eroding, if your industry is hollowed out, if your societies are divided, if your militaries are stretched, if your publics are skeptical, then you are no longer enforcing order. You are broadcasting demands you can't back up. Russia has recognized that. Russia's also recognized that time is a weapon. And the longer this war continues, the more it exposes a Western reality that is deeply uncomfortable. The West is not as unified, not as prepared, and not as dominant as it believed. Ukraine is paying the price for that revelation. Now, let me be absolutely clear. None of this is a call for cheerleading war. Quite the opposite. It is a call for realism, because realism is what prevents catastrophic escalation. There is no rational reason for a direct NATO-Russia war. None. It would not make Europe safer. It would not make America safer. It would risk nuclear thresholds that no sane person should treat casually. And yet, we are hearing more and more rhetoric that normalizes the idea of direct confrontation, this casual talk of readiness, of strikes, of inevitability. That language is a poison. It doesn't prepare peace. it prepares disaster. The irony is that if the West truly wanted peace, it would do the one thing it refuses to do. It would stop turning diplomacy into a theater of humiliation. You do not negotiate peace by demanding the other side publicly admit it is evil and then surrender. You negotiate peace by acknowledging what every serious strategist knows. Peace agreements are built on the recognition of power, realities, and security interests, especially when one party is a nuclear power. The longer the West delays that recognition, the more dangerous the environment becomes. And in that environment, a single accident, one missile that lands wrong, one aircraft downed, one strike that kills the wrong people, one false flag, one misread radar event can trigger a chain reaction that nobody can stop with a press conference. So when I look at where we are headed, I see this. Russia is gaining strategic leverage through endurance and adaptation. Ukraine is being depleted under conditions of dependency. The West is escalating rhetorically while lagging materially. And NATO is flirting with the kind of language that turns a contained war into a wider one, not because anyone is wise, but because too many leaders are trapped by their own narratives. And here is the final bitter truth, the one that cuts through all the noise. Reality always wins. Not the narrative, not the headlines, not the slogans, reality. The only choice we have is whether we accept reality early through sober diplomacy and honest assessment, or whether we let reality arrive later, wrapped in catastrophe. Because if the West continues to pretend this is a morality play it can control, while Russia treats it as war it must win, then the end point is not the one Western publics have been promised. The end point is a negotiated settlement shaped by Russian leverage, or an escalatory spiral shaped by Western arrogance. And the difference between those two outcomes is not abstract. One ends with lines on a map. The other risks ending with cities on fire. That is why this moment matters. Not because of what we hope, because of what we are doing. And if Western leaders truly care about peace, the first step is simple, but it takes courage. Stop lying, especially to yourselves. So this is where the war truly stands. Not where press conferences say it stands, not where headlines want it to stand, but where power, time, and reality have carried it. The Russia-Ukraine war is no longer about who is morally louder. It is about who can endure longer, adapt faster, and absorb damage without collapsing politically, socially, or industrially. And on that axis, whether the West likes it or not, Russia has positioned itself to outlast the strategy being used against it. That does not mean Russia will conquer Europe. That is a fantasy used to frighten populations into obedience. It means something far more mundane and far more dangerous. Russia does not need to rush, and the West cannot slow time down. Every month that passes under current conditions tightens the strategic vice. Not dramatically, not explosively, but steadily. And steady pressure wins wars far more often than heroic gestures. Ukraine tragically sits at the center of this grind. Its people are paying the price for a geopolitical gamble made by others, a gamble that assumed Russia would fold under sanctions, fracture internally, and collapse militarily. That assumption was wrong. And in war, being wrong is not an academic error. It is paid for in blood. The West now faces a choice it has been postponing for years. Adjust its expectations to reality or escalate toward catastrophe. There is no third path hidden in rhetoric. There is no secret option unlocked by one more weapons package, one more speech, or one more slogan about values. Negotiation does not mean surrender. It means recognizing that war has limits and that ignoring those limits does not produce victory, only wider destruction. History is unambiguous on this point. Great powers do not submit because they are lectured. They adjust only when confronted by either overwhelming force or mutually recognized boundaries. The West has neither the will nor the capacity for the first and continues to reject the second. And here lies the deepest irony of this entire conflict. The greatest danger to peace today is not Russian aggression alone, but Western refusal to accept that it cannot dictate outcomes unilaterally anymore. The world has changed. Power has redistributed. Industrial war has returned. And the belief that it could be managed through narrative dominance is collapsing under the weight of artillery shells, drones, and production lines. every reckless phrase spoken from a podium, every casual mention of inevitability, every normalization of direct confrontation chips away at the thin margin that still separates containment from disaster. Nuclear powers do not stumble into peace. They stumble into war when arrogance replaces restraint and when leaders confuse bravado for strength. Russia, for all its faults, is acting according to a logic that history understands. Secure borders, deny hostile military blocs, strategic advantage, and force adversaries to confront the costs of their choices. The West may dislike that logic, but ignoring it does not make it disappear. It only ensures that it asserts itself under worse conditions. The final tragedy would be this, that peace was available earlier when fewer lives were lost and fewer lines were hardened, but was rejected because it did not flatter Western self-image. Wars do not reward pride. They punish it, and so the question that remains is not whether Russia will accept Western rules. The question is whether the West will accept reality before reality imposes itself in the most unforgiving way possible. Because in the end, wars do not conclude when someone feels morally satisfied. They conclude when power balances are acknowledged. And the longer that acknowledgement is delayed, the more brutal the reckoning becomes. That is the lesson Ukraine is teaching the world, whether the world is willing to learn it or not. This war is not going to end until Russia has achieved decisive strategic control over Ukraine's core centers of gravity. That means Kyiv, Nikolaev, and Odessa. Once that happens, Ukraine will be cut off entirely from the Black Sea, eliminating any remaining possibility of a viable economic future. At that point, Ukraine ceases to function as a sovereign state in any meaningful sense. And when that collapse becomes undeniable, the temptation for Poland, Romania, and Hungary to reclaim territories that historically belonged to them will become overwhelming. Those pressures are already visible beneath the surface. In that sense, what remains of Ukraine has no future, not because Russia refuses to allow one, but because the West and Ukraine's own leadership have ensured that no future can exist. There is, even now, a deal technically still on the table. A diplomatic outcome could leave Kiev in control of most of the country, excluding the 4 or possibly 5 oblasts that Russia has already incorporated. Sergei Ryabkov has made this clear publicly, and even Western analysts like John Mearsheimer acknowledge that if diplomacy fails, Russia may take not only those territories, but several more. Instead of facing this reality, Europe has descended into outright fantasy. One of the most revealing moments came during an angry speech on the floor of the European Parliament, where a member openly demanded the theft of frozen Russian assets. That was not an off-the-cuff remark. It reflected official thinking. The so-called wake-up call supposedly came on February 14, when J.D. Vance articulated what is now embedded in Western national security strategy. But Europe has been woken up many times before. The real question is how many shocks are required before Europe actually accepts reality. The irony is that European leaders claim the United States wants to divide and weaken Europe to undermine its sovereignty and liberal democracies. They say Europe must stand up for itself, fight for sovereignty, and prove unity by delivering for Ukraine by seizing Russian assets, forcing a deal, and rebuilding Ukraine. This entire narrative collapses under minimal scrutiny. It is not strategy. It is magical thinking. Europeans still believe that more cash will win the war, that there is money sitting in Russian accounts that can simply be taken and transferred to Kiev, and that once this is done, Ukraine can finally be protected as if the last several years of escalation somehow didn't count. The reason Europe wants to steal Russian money is brutally simple. Europe doesn't have any of its own. Over the past 14 months, the UK's debt to GDP ratio has surged past 100%. France is racing toward 120%. Germany, once the paragon of fiscal restraint, has abandoned its own rules to allow deficit spending. If money alone could solve Ukraine's problem, Europeans would fund it themselves. They cannot. They are broke. What they conveniently ignore is that Russia is sitting on nearly $1 trillion worth of European assets inside Russia. Despite 19 rounds of sanctions, Russia has not seized those assets. Instead, Moscow has followed the law. But that restraint is ending. Russia has already initiated legal proceedings against the EU for the illegal seizure of its assets. Russia will pursue this through international legal mechanisms, but the outcome is inevitable. When the process concludes, Europe will find itself without leverage and without protection. Western officials compound this self-destruction with outright hysteria. British generals, air marshals, and NATO officials warn that Russia is preparing to invade Europe by 2029 or sooner. British families are told to prepare to sacrifice their lives. This is nonsense. Vladimir Putin addressed these claims directly, calling them lies and deliberate fabrications. Russia, he said, has always sought diplomatic solutions, even in the most difficult circumstances. The responsibility for war lies entirely with those who believe they can speak to Russia in the language of force. That phrase, the language of force, is revealing, because just days earlier, Zelensky stood before the Dutch parliament and openly declared that peace begins by forcing Russia into submission, by making Russia accept Western rules, by reshaping Russia's borders, and by teaching Russia how to live under the rule of law. This was not diplomacy. It was pure arrogance, chutzpah in its purest form. Zelensky projected onto Russia the very behavior practiced by the West. It was not Russia that abandoned the INF Treaty. It was not Russia that withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. It was not Russia that violated Minsk II. It was the West. Russia repeatedly sought accommodation with George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden. Each overture was rejected. NATO expanded eastward. Weapons systems threatening Moscow were installed. When Russia finally pushed back, Western outrage followed. The West forgot an old rule. If you poke a bear long enough, don't be surprised when it stands up and don't expect to outrun it. Russia has no intention of conquering Europe. But Europeans forget history. 13 European countries participated in the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. Russians remember the price, 27 million dead. They remember Romania, Hungary, Finland, Italy, Spain, Norway. Europe's claim of innocence is historical fraud. Putin has been absolutely consistent. For more than 18 months, he has said that the root causes of the conflict must be addressed. The goals of the special military operation will be achieved by diplomacy if possible, by force if necessary. Russia will liberate its historical lands and establish a buffer security zone. This message has been repeated in Beijing, in bilateral summits, in formal addresses. Diplomacy remains on the table, but only for those willing to negotiate reality, not fantasies. The true problem in Europe is psychological collapse. European elites are no longer capable of rational assessment. Like someone firing a gun under stress, they suffer tunnel vision, auditory exclusion, and distorted time perception. They have convinced themselves that Russia is an existential threat, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Another uncomfortable truth lies beneath the hatred of Putin. He refused to sell Russia to foreign interests. In 2002, he confronted the oligarchs and removed them from politics. They could make money, but in Russia, for Russia, those who refused fled and became Western instruments. This is why Putin is hated. He broke the system of control. European leaders now face a world that is no longer unipolar. They cannot accept it. A multipolar world terrifies them. Rather than adapt, they double down on denial, hoping that something magical will save them tomorrow. This is how civilizations collapse. They are not even listening to their own voters. Starmer, Macron, Merz all govern with approval ratings hovering around 20% or less. 70 to 90% of their populations oppose them. NATO itself is fracturing. Slovakia, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Serbia, unity is gone. Meanwhile, Russia advances methodically. Ukraine's energy capacity has been reduced by more than half. Cities receive as little as 6 hours of electricity per day. One major strike could plunge Kyiv into total darkness. Without power, there is no industry, no logistics, no war effort. Russia understands logistics. Time is on Russia's side. Ukraine, by contrast, is collapsing demographically. losses exceed replacements, desertion rates rival battlefield casualties, training has been reduced to days. Western friends suggest lowering the draft age to 18, destroying what remains of Ukraine's future. This is not strategy, it is desperation. And propaganda cannot overcome physics, demographics, or economics. Reality always crushes spin. When Ukraine collapses, and it will, European elites will try to use that collapse as proof of Russian aggression, as justification for further militarization, but no one will follow them. They will stand alone, shouting into an empty field, wondering where everyone went. Russia does not need to rush. Russia does not need to bluff. Russia only needs to continue doing exactly what it is doing now. And that's the part the Europeans still cannot bring themselves to say out loud. The war ends when Russia decides it has achieved its security objectives, period. Not when Brussels posts another slogan. Not when Kyiv films another emotional monologue. Not when London produces another paper strategy that has no factories behind it. And not when Washington dreams up another package that exists only as a headline. Because the battlefield doesn't care about speeches. It cares about power, logistics, and time. And time, cold, indifferent, unforgiving time, is what's killing Ukraine now. You can survive propaganda for a long while. You can survive sanctions longer than your enemies think. You can survive diplomatic theater, Western summits, coalitions, and conference room bravado, but you cannot survive lights out. You cannot wage a modern war with a nation running on 6 hours of electricity a day. You cannot keep an industrial base alive when substations are cratered, transformers are burned out, and rail nodes are hit in sequence. You cannot keep an army in the field when the replacement pipeline is broken, training is reduced to a week, and desertion becomes a second front you can't even admit exists. Europe talks about rebuilding Ukraine, while Ukraine is being methodically dismantled in real time. That is the grotesque contradiction at the heart of all their magical thinking. They keep speaking as if Ukraine is a permanent fact of history, when it is rapidly becoming a temporary episode. And here is what happens when that final veil drops, when the power grid fails, when cities go dark, when the water stops running in the high-rises, when the elevators freeze, when the sewage backs up, when the hospitals go into emergency mode and then run out of fuel. People do not debate foreign policy anymore. People do not argue about European values. People do not quote treaties. They do not care who said what at a podium in The Hague or Brussels. They move. They move toward heat, food, stability, and security. They move toward whatever authority can actually provide electricity in order. Some will go west into villages where you can burn wood and live off land. Others will go east. Not because they suddenly became romantics about flags, but because survival is the most persuasive ideology on earth. And if Russia can provide the basics, heat, light, functioning administration, then the moral lectures from Western capitals become a cruel joke told over a candle. That's the reality that terrifies the West. Not that Russia is coming for Paris. Not that Russian tanks are going to roll to Berlin. Those are bedtime stories they tell their populations to justify austerity and militarization. The real fear is much simpler. Russia is proving that the West cannot enforce its will anymore. The West can shout. It can sanction. It can censor. It can seize assets and call it law. It can print money, drown itself in debt, and try to buy time. But it cannot change the basic arithmetic of this war. It cannot conjure manpower out of thin air. It cannot manufacture a Ukrainian industrial base that is being dismantled node by node. It cannot train armies at the pace required, nor can it replace the losses, nor can it sustain the economic bleeding indefinitely, especially while its own voters are turning against the entire project. And those voters matter, whether the elites admit it or not. Because once the public finally understands what is being done in its name, once families realize they're being asked to pay more for energy, accept lower living standards, and gamble their sons' futures for a war that is already strategically lost, then the political ground under these European leaders starts to crumble. You don't need revolution. You just need disgust. You just need exhaustion. You just need enough people to say, no more, eat bread. And when that moment comes, when the crowd stops clapping, when the slogans stop working, when the money stops flowing, when the fear narrative no longer sells, what do these elites have left? They will do what failing regimes always do. They will reach for a bigger lie. They will claim that Ukraine's collapse proves Russia's evil. They will scream that Russia is about to march west. They will demand emergency powers, more spending, more surveillance, more censorship, more unity. They will try to turn their own failure into a new mandate. But the problem is their credibility will already be dead. Their citizens will not follow them into the trenches. Their militaries are not stocked. Their defense industries are not ready. Their economies are strained. Their populations are aging. Their political legitimacy is eroding. They are not standing at the front of a mighty civilization preparing to defend itself. They are standing on rotting floorboards, insisting the house is stronger than ever, while the foundation collapses beneath their feet. And Russia knows this. Russia is watching the fracture lines widen inside NATO, inside the EU, inside each national government. Russia doesn't have to invade Europe. Europe is doing a remarkable job of weakening itself. So the end game becomes painfully clear. If diplomacy is accepted on reality-based terms, then Ukraine shrinks and the shooting stops sooner. If diplomacy is rejected, if Europe insists on the language of force, insists on seizing assets, insists on pretending that more money will produce victory, then Russia takes more territory, expands the buffer zone, and finishes the job militarily. Either way, the objectives Russia has stated repeatedly are not vanishing into the air, they are being executed. And the final insult, the most bitter truth of all, is that this did not have to happen. There was a path that avoided this. There were chances for neutrality, for security guarantees that didn't threaten Moscow, for an end to NATO's reckless march, for real agreements that meant something. But the West believed it could dictate forever. It believed history had ended. It believed power belonged permanently to Washington and its satellites. It believed Russia would always retreat, always compromise, always accept humiliation. That belief died on the battlefield. So now we arrive at the moment Europe has been trying to postpone the moment where fantasy runs out and the bill comes due. And when that bill is finally presented, when Kyiv is no longer a stage for speeches, but a city confronting blackout, scarcity, and irreversible strategic defeat, then all the talk will stop. The performances will end. The microphones will go quiet. And what will remain is a cold, undeniable fact that no summit can rewrite. Russia set its red lines. The West crossed them. Russia responded, and Russia is winning. The only real choice left is not whether Russia achieves its objectives. The only choice left is how much Ukraine will still exist when the process is over, and how much of Europe's credibility, cohesion, and economic stability will be sacrificed on the altar of its own delusions before it finally admits what was obvious from the beginning. You cannot build a future on denial. You cannot negotiate from a position of collapse. And you cannot defeat a power that understands patience, logistics, and national survival by waving money you don't have in wars you cannot sustain for outcomes you cannot deliver. That is where this is heading. Not toward a triumphant Western victory, not toward some moral fairy tale where Russia is forced to kneel and confess its sins, but toward a hard settlement written by realities on the ground, realities that Russia has been shaping steadily, relentlessly, and lawfully in the only currency war ultimately recognizes: control,